All right, let's kick this off. Welcome everyone to Innovation Meets In-Flight Safety with Sentry Plus. This is our first webinar on the newest of our Sentry ADS-B receivers, Sentry Plus, newest and most advanced, I should say. And so in this webinar, we'll be going over some of those advanced features, both the new ones, as well as some of the features that have been carried over from previous Sentry devices, as well as taking a look under the hood to see some of the development challenges and insights that our team had to go through to fit all of this technology into such a small, compact case. So our presenters for today are Cole Crawford with ForeFlight, John Zimmerman from Sporties, and Ryan Braun from uAvionix. I'll let each of them introduce themselves, so go ahead, Cole.
Well, good afternoon, guys. My name is Cole Crawford. I am a product manager here at ForeFlight. The areas that I oversee are our hardware business, which is Sentry Plus, and Sentry Mini. All of our connected cockpit platforms, specifically things like ADS-B, flight plan transfer, etc. And we're excited to talk to you all today.
Thanks, Cole. Next up, John Zimmerman.
My name's John Zimmerman. I'm the president of Sporties. I've been working with ForeFlight continuously for the last 10 or 12 years in many ways, but in particular on portable devices like Sentry. And I've worked with ForeFlight and uAvionix on the latest one, Sentry Plus. Been a pilot about 25 years and love flying with data link weather.
Thanks, John. And last up, Ryan Braun.
And I'm Ryan Braun. I'm Chief Operating Officer of uAvionix. And at uAvionix, we specialize in avionics development. One of the most exciting projects we work on is the Sentry series, which we co-develop with ForeFlight. Personally, I oversee engineering, manufacturing, and support.
Thanks, Ryan. So for the topics for today, we'll start with an overview of the full Sentry family, including Sentry Mini, Sentry, and of course Sentry Plus. We'll then take a closer look at the features of Sentry Plus specifically, and go into some of those development insights that I mentioned earlier. After that, we'll look at how you can mount Sentry Plus in your aircraft. Following that, we'll look at some in-flight tips and best practices, and then we'll go on to Q&A. Before we begin, just some notes about using the GoToWebinar message system. You can ask any questions you want via the message panel, which you can open by clicking that button on the right. It looks like a speech bubble with a question mark inside of it. Just type in your question there as soon as you think of it, and we'll be responding to your questions by text, and then also reading out some of the questions at the end during Q&A. We strongly recommend that you submit questions as soon as you think of them. Don't wait until we get to Q&A because you probably won't have your question answered if you do that. So shoot away with those questions and we'll try to answer as many of them as we can. If you're having any audio problems, it might be because you're joining from a mobile device. We always recommend that you join from a computer, not an iPad or iPhone. This isn't an issue on our end. It's just kind of a quirk of the GoToWebinar platform. So we always recommend joining from a computer browser. And finally, this session is being recorded and it'll be accessible at foreflight.com/webinars tomorrow. So let's kick this thing off. Your airplane, Cole.
Thanks, Sam. We'll get started here. This is a really interesting graphic that we put out not too long after launching the device, and really we want to just show the size difference between the two. One of the things that we noticed when we launched Sentry originally that people loved and was a really important feature of the device early on was the compact size. We were aiming to try to get as much features and functionality into a small space as possible, and I believe we originally marketed it as small as a deck of cards. And that's really about the form factor. And the Sentry Mini is obviously just thinner and lighter weight. So when we were looking at Sentry Plus, we wanted to fit more capability in the device. And we wanted to make the form factor look a little bit different and a little more interesting. But we also were very conscious about how much bigger we were making it and wanted to make sure that it wasn't getting big and would still fit on a window very well, and would be easy to hold in the palm of your hand. And this is a great representation here just to show you. It is a little bigger, but it's not very much bigger. It's basically an inch wider and an inch taller. So not too terribly much bigger. And it's, when I pull my wallet out, it basically covers the same area. It's, comparable to what your iPhone would be or smaller than that. And the uAvionix team spent an enormous amount of time trying to figure out how to fit all of these features that we're going to talk about in that tiny little space. And that ended up being one of the largest challenges of this project, which we'll talk a little more about.
Yeah, we'll dive into that, but it really is a lot of technology that we've packed in there. We didn't increase the size just to increase it. There's real reasons and limits of physics in some cases when making a multi-radio device like this that caused the size increase. But we're really proud of what we've been able to get into this package. I think it's our best product yet.
Yeah, one of the main things, like the specific reason why we went wider, which I think is worth stating, is getting some more room for the antennas themselves to be further away from the primary electronics in the middle. Improves the reception, and we spend a lot of time when we work and develop these products on making the ADS-B reception and the GPS and all the other RF reception as good as we can get it. And going a touch wider gave us some improvement in the antenna design that we were able to make that we're, I think, after all that work, are happy with.
So Sentry Plus is the newest and latest and greatest in the top end of the Sentry family. There are two other Sentry models there, the original Sentry at $499, which to me is a great value, kind of all-in-one. Has the core features in a small package at a good price. Sentry Mini I look at as just your bare bones, but a good performer if you just want weather and traffic. You don't care about battery, you don't care about AHRS, you just want to look at radar and traffic on your iPad. There is no better value in terms of getting weather in your iPad than a Sentry Mini. $299 one time, no subscriptions, and you're off and running. But I think for a lot of pilots who are looking for an all-in-one device, the Sentry Plus is the best all-around package because it really is both an everyday device and an all-in-one backup. It's got the weather and traffic and GPS. It's got the carbon monoxide detector, but then it's got all those higher-end features that can really take it beyond just a weather receiver. It's got that automatic flight data recording, which I've come to love. Helps me debrief my flights, make my flying better. It's got some of those nice higher-end upgrades like a G-meter. And the screen, while it's a small thing, I've found really handy just because it helps me know my status and, again, makes it a little bit more of a self-contained device. So I think there's a Sentry for every type of pilot. If you're flying 25 hours a year in an LSA, that Sentry Mini may be enough. But if you're really doing cross-country trips, I think that's where that Sentry Plus becomes a great value. And for me, a Sentry Plus and an iPad is pretty much my flight bag. That's got everything I need for even a long trip.
Yeah, for me, I've really noticed the difference in the Sentry Plus in my actual flying on a consistent basis is in the battery, or a lot of it is. A 12-hour battery, which is in the Sentry, does get you a long way, and you can certainly do some cross countries, some long cross-country trips, but I very consistently fly from Texas to the East Coast and back. And so for me, the 12 hours was more than enough to get, one way. But now that I've got all the way out to 18 hours, I can not even really have to fuss with it as far as charging it there and back. So that's been a big game changer for me, is I really never have to worry about the battery just because of how long it lasts. And then really the other thing, which we'll talk about more, that I've really noticed is the big differentiator is how I log and track my flights, and how I manage my iPad battery as a result of all of this, because of the on Sentry Plus track log recording. But just as you said it there, John, I really think the way we're setting up this value proposition is if you just need the GPS and you want traffic and you don't need the battery, then Sentry Mini is a great affordable option there for you, where you get that stuff that you need that's going to make a really big difference in your flying if you don't have a GPS or ADS-B receiver. Sentry is going to get you that battery that you really need and the backup attitude and the CO. And Sentry Plus is really taking it to the next level, where you can really do some serious trips with it and have really all the features you're going to need in one small compact package.
I think when we sit down and have planned this out. We've been very intentional. When I say we, ForeFlight and uAvionix work very closely on these product designs over a long period of time, and we're really trying to consider what features people are going to be looking for next, and things that will be nice value adds and actually help with your everyday flying. So these are not things that we're adding as gizmos and tchotchkes. These are real things that as pilots, which almost everyone at our companies are, that we want to have in the cockpit with us. And I think what you look at on the deltas, the things added here to the Sentry Plus, these are all things that I've wanted personally in a product. And we've been able to finally get to the point where the technology enables us to do some of these things that in the past battery power constrained or size and weight constrained.
Yeah, so on the display here, first thing I want to point out that I think may not be immediately apparent is the Sentry Eagle that you notice in the dead top center of the display. That actually will only show up on the screen if Sentry Plus is talking to one instance of ForeFlight Mobile. So that's a very quick indicator that you can look at to see, is Sentry hooked up and talking to ForeFlight right now? So if the iPad's connected to it, but you don't have ForeFlight open, then you won't see the Eagle. But as soon as ForeFlight's open and now they've established a connection or starting to talk and exchange data, then you will see that Sentry Eagle there, so you know that's all working. You've obviously got the battery on there and which screen you're on, but we wanted to minimize, how many different displays were on there, but also try to get as much data available to the pilot as possible. I personally typically fly around on the speed indicator, mostly because I, want to get something that's really easy to read from my passengers to see how fast we're going, because I'm, a lot of my passengers still find it to be a novelty to fly around in a private airplane. So they like, you always get asked, especially if there's any younger kids on board, how fast are we going? And so that's just a good way to point, just keep your eyes on that and you can watch that. But sometimes when I'm working on my commercial rating right now. And so sometimes when I'm doing different maneuvers, I'll have the G meter up, or I'll have that up on the iPad, or both.
And I think it's worth just talking a little bit about the display technology itself. The great thing about OLEDs are that they are very sunlight readable, and they actually create their own backlight. So it's what's called an organic light emitting diode. And so there's an array of little diodes back there that create their own light, which is different than most displays, which actually have a backlight beneath them. And this is really important because it makes it very sunlight readable. You can actually have this not have to reflect light and use a backlight, but actually create the light itself. So for sunlight readability, these are the absolute best displays out there. This is a single color display, which is perfect for the type of things that we need to show on the screen. But it's really nice to get this technology in here that we know is going to be readable in all types of cockpit environments.
One tip I really like with that screen, Cole, is it's a great way to make it part of your regular scan. Once I'm in cruise, I'm looking at oil pressure, altitude, the standard things. And it's a really easy way to check and make sure your Sentry's still on, connected, getting good signal. It takes, a second, and you can check it every 10, 15 minutes, and that's a good flow to get into, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
We have opted to keep the same indicator lights that we had on the previous Sentry as well. However, I know internally there was discussion if you remove those and only use the screen, because we have the capability to put rich information there. But we really liked the consistency from a product family perspective of still offering those same discrete indicator lights, as well as having that richer display on the screen.
Yeah, and part of the reason for that design decision too is that you might be, for example, on the acceleration screen, and without having the LED, then you wouldn't necessarily know what the status of the GPS is. If you've lost GPS signal, or you've lost AHRS or whatnot. So it's a different way to monitor all of that at the same time.
And the screen, the backlight is controlled. There's a ambient light sensor as well. that controls the brightness of the LEDs and the screen.
Yeah, and also if you don't want the auto brightness setting, if you go into ForeFlight's devices and then select Sentry Plus, there is a slider as well that you can just select whatever brightness setting you want if you don't want it trying to automatically select the correct brightness for you. You can just set it wherever you'd like, which we do actually see a good number of users do that with the existing Sentry product, and I'll be interested to see how that we see the same thing with Sentry Plus.
I think more than any other product out there or product line, the integration that Sentry has with ForeFlight to be able to control those type of settings really sets it apart. And it makes that user experience that much better. You don't have to download a separate app to go manage particular settings or go to a web page or use tools that quickly become outdated. Everything's really integrated as part of those settings. So things like the brightness, like Cole said, you can access directly through ForeFlight, which to me is just a huge advantage. And that extends not just to settings, but the firmware updates, which are automatically delivered. And now, especially with the track logs that are automatically captured here, that level of integration is all the more important.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't want to forget about talking about the thing which I think has sort of become a commodity these days, but dual band ADS-B in. It seems like these days almost all pilots have some source of ADS-B in, and I really think they all should. So just like its predecessor, Sentry Plus also has the dual band ADS-B in. So when you hear the term dual band, if you're not familiar, what that means is that it receives ADS-B on both 1090 megahertz and 978 megahertz. So some airplane transponders use the one frequency and some use the other. And if you've heard of ADS-B weather or FIS-B weather, that's only broadcast on 978 megahertz. So it's really important that you have a receiver that can receive both, so that you can see the full air-to-air traffic picture, the FIS-B weather picture, and the ground-to-air traffic picture, which we've talked about in some previous webinars, and I know John also has done a number of webinars on how to use data link and how to use ADS-B traffic. But let's not overlook this feature as part of the product. Is ADS-B has really transformed the way people fly, and has reduced weather-related accidents and collision-related accidents. So we're still really happy with this feature. And when you have Sentry Plus and you connect, you'll see all the traffic that's picked up by Sentry on the map, as long as you're on the map screen. And you should be able to tap and see where any targets are, see what frequency it's coming over, and see their tail number and all that kind of stuff. And I'd encourage, if you're interested to learn more about that, we have a webinar more specifically diving into how to use ADS-B traffic and weather, where we talk about a lot of scenario-based, ways to use it and things just outside of collision avoidance, how other people use it for other things. And we might bring up a few scenarios here at the end about that.
One thing to point out here, I think that's important to note for anybody who's been flying with ADS-B for a while, is that since 2020, when the FAA's ADS-B out mandate went into effect, you really are seeing more and richer traffic information. I mean, sure, there are still limitations and you're not going to see every last airplane in the sky. But if you've got ADS-B out in your airplane, and with more and more airplanes around you having ADS-B out, this is a really rich and nearly complete traffic picture that I find myself using every flight. You're absolutely right, Cole. The weather's number one for me, but this is a close second that I use traffic on every single flight.
Yeah, and I also find myself using traffic to tell me about weather, which is kind of a weird thing that I talk about, where if you've got a system coming up in front and you can see the traffic and follow where they're going, you can get a good idea of where the weather is based on where the traffic's not, or where the traffic is going.
And Cole, I think you said, we take it for granted, traffic, because everyone has traffic now. But all traffic is not created equal. So we take advantage of things like we take advantage of a car, right? We understand that a car can get us from place to place. But we have worked really hard, especially through the maturation of the Sentry product line, to increase the performance with every iteration and to really optimize it for the package that we have here. And internally at uAvionix, we've shipped more ADS-B receivers than anyone in the world. We very intimately understand, how to design these, how to build these, and we've created core silicon technologies that can act as radios for this type of technology. But a lot of it comes down to the package and to the antenna design. And internally, we do all of our own antenna simulations. We use something called ANSYS HFSS, which does electromagnetic simulations. We do not; these are not off-the-shelf type of solutions that you're able to buy. So although there are off-the-shelf receivers and things that do exist, we believe this is the best performing receiver in the world, both for traffic and for really bringing in that full weather picture, which comes to the same antennas. So it's done with a lot of intentionality and a lot of engineering work to get to that point. And so dual band may be the standard these days, but this is the best in class implementation of dual band ADS-B.
Yeah, that's a great point, Ryan. As part of this project, we recognized that ADS-B in was still going to be, even though this is a new product with lots of new features, that ADS-B in was going to be the heart and soul core feature of the whole product line. And we weren't willing to compromise on anything as far as ADS-B in reception. In fact, we required to be best in class as part of this project, even with all the new features that are in there as well. So there was a lot of focus, time, and energy on both companies here to get that in there and make that as high quality as possible.
Mm-hmm. And I think maybe it's a good time to talk a little bit about the partnership that ForeFlight and uAvionix have here. I mean, these products, I think they're special in the industry and in the market because of how we co-develop them. I mean, we really work together diligently as two teams becoming one to design a product that I don't think either could do on our own, and that's bringing together a lot of our hardware expertise with so much of ForeFlight's expertise in what the customer really needs and wants, and making that really tightly integrated package. So I'm made prouder with every consecutive release here, and I think that this was the prime example of how we can work together to make the industry better and build better products for customers.
Yeah, absolutely. The cross-company collaboration on such a technical project can be very challenging, but also rewarding. And we've been able to do it now for 5 years and push out a number of great products. Okay, so we'll talk real briefly about ADS-B weather. More specifically, it's referred to as FIS-B weather, Flight Information Service Broadcast. And if you're not familiar, ADS-B weather is provided by ground stations that are set up by the FAA across the United States. And those sort of broadcast, you can imagine like an AM loop, or actually kind of like listening to an AWAS, where it, depending on which part of the loop you're in, it just keeps broadcasting in a loop. And Sentry picks the signal up over 978 megahertz and then streams it to the iPad, and it shows up as these different weather products. And you can see the list of, this is not a complete list, I don't believe, but it shows you what all types of weather is available over FIS-B. And the interesting thing about Sentry and Sentry Plus is that they have 30 minutes of weather replay storage. So if you have your iPad closed or not on, or for whatever reason, your ForeFlight's not connected to Sentry, it will store the last 30 minutes worth of FIS-B weather. And as soon as the iPad connects, it'll replay all of those 30 minutes worth of weather back to the iPad. So you can see whatever you might have missed in the last 30 minutes, which is useful for things like NEXRAD radar, METARs, and other things that were broadcast in there. So one thing to note about this, like I did say, is that it's based on terrestrial ground stations that are currently only deployed in the United States. So the coverage area is limited to the United States, though there are some trials of UAT going on outside of the United States, which maybe in a little bit Ryan can explain some of those trials that are going on. But before we get to that, John, I know you often speak about flying with ADS-B weather. Do you want to give us your sort of 3 or 4 best tips for how to fly with ADS-B weather?
Yeah, I just think ADS-B weather at the end of the day is one of the great revolutions in GA flying. So it's easy to overlook, but it really can make it a lot safer. We hear about the delay sometimes. This is not real-time weather you're looking at. Obviously, that's true. That just means to me that you use it for strategic, not tactical avoidance. Miss the whole weather system. Don't try to pick through it. But I think something illustrated on this page that's also overlooked is how many weather products there are. Everybody knows about radar and METARs, and those are great. But I think a lot of pilots don't use all the tools they have there. So ADS-B has added over the years tools like icing forecast, turbulence forecast, lightning. If you're trying to decide whether a system in front of you is a convective storm that you want to stay out of or just rain, use all those tools. Use the cloud top tool, use the lightning, use everything there to try to get a sense of the full weather picture. And I think that's really when ADS-B weather becomes more than just looking at the radar and missing the red cells, but using all the tools you can have, not just a safer flight, but a more comfortable one.
Yeah, absolutely. I look at the one on this list where it says AHRS and SIGMETs, and I just find it funny because I remember when I first started flying before I ever had an ADS-B receiver, as a student pilot, you'd be doing your cross country and you'd hear, ATC come over and say, be advised, convective SIGMET or convective AHRS or whatever. And you'd hear them describe a bunch of these lat lawns or tell you, east of Kentucky and all this stuff. And you're like, how, you're already overwhelmed flying your cross country as a student. And like, I have no idea where this thing is. Let me get out my pencil and try to draw this. And it was, it's nearly impossible to use when you hear that over the radio. And now, you're flying and you can see the AHRS visually or the SIGMET visually on the map before they've even broadcasted over the radio to you audibly. So it's at that point, you're already looking at, you're 10 minutes ahead of them by the time they're doing that. And it's much, much, much easier to consume the graphic than it is to try to draw that out on paper. Ryan, why don't you, you're a little more keyed into what UAT trials are going on outside of the US. You want to give us a little bit of an intro on that?
Sure. Although UAT or 978 megahertz is primarily considered a United States only technology, there are quite a few other countries looking at it. It's technically what's called a data link. And so it's capable of sending a lot of information. 20% of it's reserved currently to send weather. So every country in the world has this frequency reserved. And we've been working with regulators in other countries to hopefully build up that ecosystem. That's not something that we can say today is going to happen. Each country needs to make their decisions on it. But we do know that there are trials ongoing in the United Kingdom that we've supported and provided the infrastructure and equipment for. There's trials that have been ongoing in Canada. And a number of other countries in Europe have either deployed shortly operational or longer term solutions and are looking towards building this capability. So, I think long term, the hope is that we'll find ways to pay for and equip more places with data link weather, with FIS-B weather. Like John said, it's a huge safety benefit. All we need to do is get everybody on board with that. And once that is there, it would automatically just start working. So I know when we've run the trials in the UK, that we have people who would fly back and forth, and they'd say as soon as they got close to see their ForeFlight light up again with their radar data or their METAR data, it was very reassuring, and it's nice that there is that compatible system worldwide. It's just not that it's just not operational everywhere yet. The other thing to note is that it was mentioned that these products update over time, and each country can choose their own products that they want to put in there. In 2018, the FAA added a number of products like lightning and turbulence and icing. And the receiver itself, the Sentry, is capable of supporting any of those products as they're added later. So whether it's the FAA in the United States or abroad, as products are added, those are really just software updates to ForeFlight to support those. So there's nothing that would become outdated there. It's an easy update.
Thanks, Ryan. So I want to spend some time talking about FLARM traffic. This is probably a new topic for many of the webinar listeners. So FLARM is a collision, or really traffic avoidance technology, and it's mostly used, it is used all over the world, but I would say it's most popular in Europe. So FLARM, effectively, you can have FLARM transmitters that, report the aircraft's position, and effectively Sentry can pick that up and then show it to you as a traffic target on the map. So very similar to ADS-B as far as what functionality you get. The thing that's interesting and why we included this in Sentry Plus is that FLARM in Europe is much more popular with glider pilots and small aircraft pilots and a number of pilots in that community there. And so if you only have ADS-B traffic, you might be missing some of those FLARM targets, especially in that region of the world. And it was really important to us to figure out how to make the traffic picture in ForeFlight as complete as possible. Anything that has any kind of transmitter that's transmitting its position, we want to pick it up and show it on the map. So Sentry Plus has a FLARM receiver. And what's really interesting, and what was a very hard technical feat for our friends at uAvionix to figure out how to solve, was showing both FLARM and ADS-B at the same time and having both of those radios working at the same time without interfering with each other. So that was a large feat to overcome. One thing to note about FLARM is FLARM in ForeFlight does require a decoding license. FLARM is a for-profit business, and so they need to make some money to keep the lights on. And so to get FLARM working in ForeFlight with Sentry Plus, you have to purchase a decoding license, which you can add on to your existing ForeFlight subscription by going to foreflight.com/buy. And then you can add that FLARM decoding license there. So while we're here and talking about this, Ryan, I think one thing that'd be interesting to talk about is part of this challenge of adding FLARM traffic. One thing that presented itself as a challenge, a pretty hard design challenge, is how do you add a fifth radio to Sentry in that teeny tiny space? And trying to fit, well, I think we have 5 radios in this product in that small space with batteries, was pretty incredibly challenging, and to not only fit them, but also make all the antennas work and give them enough of their own space that they function well.
Yeah, it really is. FLARM was kind of the kickoff of that challenge for us. We've known for a long time that we wanted to be able to present that full traffic picture, as we have more customers in Europe and worldwide that use that technology. It's on a different frequency. So it would be easier if it was on 978 megahertz or 1090 megahertz, but it's on what's called an ISM band. It's a unlicensed frequency, and that's a European specific frequency here. And so it really requires a completely separate radio to be able to process. So for the air reception of air traffic and weather, we have 3 different radios there. We have the FLARM radio, a 978 megahertz radio, and a 1090 megahertz radio. And of course, we have to have antennas for all of those that are specifically tuned to be able to receive over great distance those. So that was part of that challenge of designing those antennas, of designing the radio infrastructure that can support that, of having a package that minimizes shadowing and it has really good RF performance for those 3 radios. We also, as you mentioned, have more radios in there because we have a GPS receiver, which is similar to what we have in Sentry, but as part of this new package, a different antenna design. And then, of course, we have our Wi-Fi. And that Wi-Fi here is even more complicated because we have essentially 2 Wi-Fis. We have the ability, which we'll talk about, to support a mode that essentially allows you 2 Wi-Fi connections, one of them to an aircraft-hosted Wi-Fi, and sending the information through that. So we have what's called a client and AP mode there. So a lot of radio things going on in a small package. And we like I mentioned before, we do a lot of electromagnetic simulation, a lot of course, best practice on design. And at the end of the day, there's physics that allow only so much to fit in a box and maintain good performance. But we pull out all the tricks in the book to be able to do this. It's also important when we put all of these radios and all of these electronics into one box, that everything is very, very low power. So, we're not going to go backwards with our battery life moving forward. And that is a design constraint here. And we're really able to do this by the unique technology that has been developed and enhanced over these many years of delivering receivers, which is the custom silicon that we have that powers these. So if you ever crack open one of these, and I don't recommend doing it because it will void your warranty, but if you do, you would see a very, very small chip in there that performs the radio functions for these. And essentially we have 3 separate chips that power each of these different receivers for traffic. Each of them, custom developed specifically to support 978 megahertz UAT or 1090 megahertz ADS-B or 860 band FLARM. So each of those are built specifically to do that, and they all operate very efficiently at a very low power, very different than most people in the industry have built these systems, which are off-the-shelf technologies, which they adapt. That's never as power efficient, and that's really how we get to that, crazy, wonderful battery life on this, and are able to put so much in a single box instead of offering it as an add-on, which we've talked about in the past. Maybe this becomes more of a modular system, but we really didn't want that. There's a lot of problems with that, and so being able to reach the technological point that we can, where we've put it all inside one box and it performs better, not worse, is really the end goal for everything that we're doing with this product.
Absolutely. So Sentry Plus has a Wi-Fi client mode. So let me explain what that is. So original Sentry and Sentry Mini both act as an access point. So they have their own little Wi-Fi network. It's usually named Sentry _ 3 or 4 characters. Sentry Plus can also do this as well. So that feature is not going away, just to be clear. But Sentry Plus can do that and be a client on another network at the same time. So you don't have to choose. So this is similar to how setting up an Amazon Alexa works, if you're familiar with that, or a Google Home. So effectively, you can have your iPad join Sentry Plus and then tell Sentry Plus to go join some other network as well at the same time. So this would be used by pilots that already have some kind of wireless network on board their aircraft. So you can, for example, GoGo routers or Satcom Direct routers and those kinds of products that are out there. You can connect to Sentry Plus and say, hey, go join my GoGo router. And Sentry Plus will join it, and then you have your iPad join the GoGo router, and now ForeFlight is talking to Sentry Plus, and they're both on the GoGo router, so that you can have all the capabilities of both products at the same time without having to choose which thing you want to use. This was a very interesting UX design and technical design challenge for us to make this all work. But anyway, when you have this set up, you have some pretty interesting opportunity, because when you're connected in this manner, you're connected to a GoGo router or a Satcom Direct router, and connected to Sentry Plus via that, you have both all the ADS-B weather products available, and you also have access to imagery and other things that you would download via the internet, because you have both of them at the same time. So that makes things very interesting for those of you that want to do that.
And from a technical standpoint, we'll keep saying this, but we've upgraded at almost every piece of the device to support these additional functions. And in this case, the Wi-Fi chipset itself has been upgraded to be able to support this additional mode. We've actually doubled the available memory to the processor, and that allows us to do things that we were unable to do before. And supporting this type of function is difficult in a device like this, and we're again proud to have been able to bring that to the customer.
Yeah, absolutely. Sentry Plus has a G meter, so it measures the normal acceleration of the airplane. So just to be clear about what that is that's what you usually hear in flight training, right? It's the acceleration of the airplane out, through the top of the wing, basically going straight out the roof of the airplane. So that's the actual amount of load on the wing. And this is really interesting because you can see it in ForeFlight as a cockpit instrument, which you can select. And you can also see it on the Sentry Plus display itself. And you can see it in track log view, which we'll talk about here in a second. But this is neat, especially if you're doing flight training. Like right now, I'm working on my commercial rating, so this is of interest to me with the commercial steep turns that I'm working on. You can see how many G's you're pulling as you go around, and it's unfortunately a very obvious indicator when you're reviewing your track log if you weren't maintaining altitude, because you'll notice that your G load was not where it should be if you're not maintaining altitude while you're in that bank. So yeah, it's really neat here. Why don't we show some quick screens of what the track log looks like. So here's a particular bad example of me doing some steep turns. And you can see the pitch, or in this case, the bank and the G at over time on a graph. And you can see as I'm doing those steep turns, what kind of G you were pulling. Also, if you press the info tab, you'll be able to see the maximum and minimum G on any particular flight or any particular log. So you can go and see, like, okay, what was the peak G that I achieved on that flight, if you're really interested in that kind of thing. Or did I ever get to negative G, or did I just nearly unload at 0 G? You can look at all that stuff, which is really fun and interesting. The other thing I've started noticing myself is if you're doing on a long cross country and you're just flying straight and level, well, it'll probably be 1 G the whole time. But if you hit any turbulence or chop, you can pretty easily pick that out on this graph where those events were, just by seeing the sort of vibration of the line, more or less.
One great use for this, Cole, that we're starting to play with in our flight school here at Sporty's is as an instructional tool. It's obvious that as I bank from 30 to 45 to 60 degrees, the G load is going to increase if I'm maintaining altitude. But this is just a great way to show that and display that. Go fly a steep turn, go fly a turn at 15 degrees of bank, then 30, then 45, then 60, and just have what you have there, the bank and G load graph up, and you can really easily see what that relationship looks like. It's also great for aerobatics training, which may be a little bit more niche, but a lot of times when you're learning aerobatics, G is a critical factor. If you're going to do a 2G pull-up and, you want to do a loop or a roll, a lot of times beginning aerobatic pilots do not pull up enough. You're sort of afraid to really pull, which can mean you run out of energy and the maneuver doesn't go so well. So it has great value there, because you can just leave your iPad tucked away and let Sentry Plus record it. And then when you're back on the ground in 1G, you can replay that and say, how did I do on my pull-up there? Was that 2 Gs? Was that 1.5? And how did I do over the top of that loop? Did I let it float, or did I keep pulling too hard? So another one of those features, I think lots of applications as you get to know it.
Absolutely. Well, let's look at the flight data recorder feature. I think this is the single feature that I'm personally and selfishly the most excited about. So I'll explain how this works and what all we've done different here compared to some other options in the industry, and how we've really spent a lot of time and energy thinking about optimizing this. So Sentry Plus has its own memory, or its own on-device storage, and effectively whenever you've got the device powered on, it's recording a track log from the time you start it up to the time you power it down. And what happens is you have this ability to download them onto your iPad, either manually or automatically, and we'll talk about some of that, about how the automatic track log import works. But why this is nice is it now sort of decouples your track logs and logbook and all that other thing in ForeFlight from having to have the iPad open all the time. So, or even have ForeFlight running all the time. You can now go and for example, let's say you're an aerobatic pilot, or you've got some other case where you don't want to have the iPad out for whatever reason all the time. You can go fly a flight without ForeFlight necessarily open while you go and do that, and it's going to record with the same fidelity as if it was open. And then you download the track log, and it'll automatically create the logbook entry and all that jazz for you. So for me, in my personal flying, why I really enjoyed this is when you're going on long cross countries, you may not want to have the iPad open all the time, especially in my particular cockpit. I have a lot of sun that's beating down on the iPad, and it'll get decently warm. And I'll, use a lot of battery on a full cross-country day. So what I'll do now that I have this and I don't need to record it on my iPad all day, I can, turn the iPad screen off for a little while, or, put it in a different area because I don't have to worry about the track log. My track log is being recorded by Sentry Plus, whether or not ForeFlight is open or in the foreground or any of that kind of stuff, which is excellent. And then it's automatically imported into my iPad at the end of the flight. So the other really interesting thing about the way we did this product is you can turn on a feature called automatic track log import. That's a setting. You can turn that on or off if you have Sentry Plus. If you have it on, then ForeFlight is going to try to automatically sync all of the track logs from Sentry Plus that it hasn't seen before, so that you don't have to go into the menu and download them yourself. So when you're about to shut the Sentry Plus off, ForeFlight will go and grab the current flight that you just recorded and download it onto your iPad for you, so you don't have to fiddle with any of this later on. So I want to do a quick demo of how this works as far as manual and automatic track log import. So I'm here in the track logs view. If you want to download a track log from Sentry Plus while you're connected to it, you can come to the track logs view here and press this little import button on the top left. And you can see from Sentry Plus, you tap that. And now I can see a list of all the track logs on my device. And they're listed in time order. So the current one at the very top is me just sitting in our little recording booth here. But the other ones are actual flights that I've actually taken. And if you want to download one, you can tap to download. And one thing we spent a lot of time doing is figuring out how to optimize the download time, per hour. So I think we're something around less than 10 seconds per hour of recording, which is really nice. Sentry Plus will record the last 16 flights directly on its own memory. Let me show you one other additional thing here. So you can see I just downloaded this track log here. This is what it looks like. And it will automatically create a draft logbook entry for me as well. So that's all set up there. And I can go view that if I want to over in logbook and approve that. And it's got all the times there. So just like any other track log from Sentry and ForeFlight, you can toggle through the different layers and see pitch, bank, and G-load. If you want to turn on automatic track log import, it will ask you in the first run flow if you want to turn that on, but you can turn it on anytime by going to Devices, Sentry Plus, and you can press automatic track log import right there and turn that feature on.
Cole, I think the thing with the flight data recorders is sort of like that long battery life. It just makes it so automatic that you use it more often because it's always recording. You'll have to remember to start and stop it, and then it automatically imports. What I find is when I'm done with the flight and I'm sitting at home or I'm sitting in the FBO, I just open up ForeFlight and it's there. I don't have to think about it. And so, as you said, I can make a quick logbook entry, but then I can quickly debrief a flight that honestly, if it took a long time, I would never go to the trouble to do it. But because it's right there, it's really easy to see my most recent flight. And there's some really practical applications of this. I mean, as simple as look at your traffic patterns and see, are you correcting for wind drift? Are you flying a rectangular course? Are you letting the wind blow you towards or away from the runway? Great on instrument approaches. I did some recurrent training recently in the airplane, and it was great for both the air work. I could see my steep turns and see if I maintained, a steady bank angle, see if I maintained altitude. But then also on instrument approaches, how did I do an altitude control? How did I have a stabilized descent towards the final approach fix and then the minimum descent altitude? Did I maintain altitude? Did I level off at MDA? Did I maintain center line? There's just all kinds of ways. It sort of takes the emotion out of the debrief instead of saying, oh yeah, it was good or bad. It's a really, data-driven way to look at a flight and see how you did. And I think if you can have some of the discipline to do that, it's amazing how quickly you can improve your flying because it's right there in full color. You can see how you did even on the simplest flight. So I think this is maybe one of those features that pilots don't fully appreciate until they start flying with it. But once it's there and it just sort of works automatically, it's one of my favorite features in this device, and I use it just about every time I fly.
Yeah, absolutely. One other thing I do want to mention that I'm pretty excited about is we've also added this sort of auto on-off. Effectively, the device can be will turn on automatically when you plug it into ship power and turn off when you turn the master switch off. And this is a setting, by the way, so you don't have to use this feature. But if you have this feature on, so what's really neat here is if you combine the automatic track log import feature of Sentry Plus with the automatic power feature of Sentry Plus, and you've got this hooked up to your airplane's power, well, when you flip the master switch on, Sentry Plus will power on and start recording. And then you go fly your flight and whatever you want to do. You land, you flip the master switch off, and Sentry Plus will eventually power down and stop its recording and import it into ForeFlight. And now your track log on Sentry Plus that just got automatically imported into ForeFlight will be the exact duration as your Hobbs meter.
So there's some additional circuitry that allows us to detect when ship power has activated and turn on the device. But we're smart about how we shut down the power on that. So it's important that as soon as power goes off, we don't immediately shut it down. We have a battery. We should operate on that if we think that the aircraft is still in flight. And so there's an algorithm that is used to perform that shutdown, and that's based on the detected ground speed of the aircraft. So we essentially wait for you to be not moving for 45 seconds with some additional provisions in there before we'll shut that down. In essence, we end up with a very automated on-off functionality. So whenever you're in the aircraft and ready to take flight, should start up on you, and as soon as you've landed and stopped on the ramp, you should automatically shut down. So we aim for a really seamless experience there.
Yeah, and we've talked about the 18 hours of battery life that you can get on a full charge, and how you can see that on the screen. One other thing I do want to mention on power and battery while we're here is something that's probably overlooked by many, which is this new support for USB power delivery. So I think one opportunity that we missed when we launched Sentry, it has a USB-C adapter, but it doesn't support this thing called USB power delivery, which is, you probably have heard of it referred to as fast chargers and some other different terms you hear thrown about. But effectively, USB power delivery just allows the charger to dynamically tell you how much power it's going to put through the charger, so it can charge at different rates. So when you're charging a Sentry, you have to make sure you have an old USB-A port so that it's only getting a lower amount of current coming through it. So there's some types of chargers that Sentry won't charge on, unfortunately. But with the new device, Sentry Plus supports USB power delivery, so you can charge it with pretty much any USB-C charger you can find. I remember when we first got the first prototypes, one of the first things I did is I have one of those beefy Mac chargers that can charge my Mac really quickly. And I plugged it straight into that, and it'll charge off basically any USB-C power charger, which makes things a lot easier because now you don't have to worry so much about what all chargers are in your flight bag for your iPad and your Sentry and maybe your laptop or whatever else. It just helps you consolidate down what all you need to bring in your bag of kit. So the carbon monoxide monitor. So this was a really big deal when we launched this with the Sentry, with the first one. And we weren't going to remove it from the new Plus either. So just like Sentry, it has the carbon monoxide monitor embedded into it. And even without ForeFlight in the picture, it can alert you of higher dangerous levels to carbon monoxide via the LED indicator, the audible alarm that's in Sentry, and now the screen as well. So you can see that changing status there. But if you're connected to ForeFlight Mobile and you have one of these events happen, ForeFlight will also give you an audible and visual alert of the dangerous levels of carbon monoxide. And we have seen over the last couple of years since Sentry's been out with this feature, we have seen just story after story after story after story of this making a powerful impact in saving lives in the real world. We just wanted to hear or have you all hear some of the testimonials from these customers in their own words.
I was a firefighter and a flight paramedic. I was flying with one of my students who also was a firefighter.
A student of mine, he purchased a Cessna 210 and he wanted me to work with him.
My wife and I were returning from Houston area up to the Northeast Texas, Sulphur Springs. I have a Sentry device.
And he had just bought the Sentry. He was bragging about it, how cool it was, and I knew that it could do carbon monoxide.
And that was the number one reason I got it.
We started getting the CO alarm going off.
We were running around, I think 8,000 feet or so. I noticed that I got a CO alert.
And all of a sudden I saw this notification, and then also the alarm was going off on the Sentry.
My wife was sleepy and drowsy.
I have to tell you, there was no sign of it.
We have SOGs, standard operating guidelines at the fire department. According to our SOGs, also, if anybody was present in the building at that time, we would have to call an ambulance and have them evaluated further due to that high of a level of carbon monoxide. I was shocked by how quickly carbon monoxide can become an issue. The mechanic looked at the plane and
he called me back after one day and said, "Hey, yeah, you got cracks through your manifold, man, lots of them."
Some of the panels underneath were not sealed.
And basically all the exhaust was being ducted directly into the cabin.
It doesn't smell, it doesn't have a color.
It's tasteless. You can't detect it with your natural senses.
Carbon monoxide is so sticky to the blood that the blood wants it more than it wants the oxygen.
If we didn't have our Sentry connected to my iPad and ForeFlight, we would never know.
It made a believer out of me.
I'm pretty sure something bad probably would have happened if we hadn't had the Sentry.
A lot of people will write in that they even didn't believe it and figured it had to be a false alert, but for whatever reason, they go in and have their mechanic look at it, and sure enough, there's a hose clamp that wasn't quite on, or there's a, something was missed, and yeah, it was actually pouring carbon monoxide into the cabin. And we see those over and over and over again. So I do want to mention real briefly something that I think, again, kind of similar to AHRS, where people treat it as a commodity, but where we've really invested a lot of time in thinking about this and doing something a lot more than just off the shelf, is our GPS, our position capabilities, which probably more technically should be referred to as GNSS, which we'll talk about here in a second. But with this product, we did do some changes and improvements to the antenna that the GPS chip uses for better signal quality. But I also want to mention and talk about the fact that the GPS chip, the GNSS chip in the device is multi-constellation. And you may be wondering, well, what does that mean practically? Why do I care about that? But it mostly has to do with jamming and spoofing. And Ryan, I'm going to let you hit this and, expound on why that's important and why I might care about that.
Yeah, so like Cole said, we did increase the size of the antenna, and that is important because the larger antenna, the more signals you can pull in. It also helps with different orientations for the device. And we thought that was especially important on this, hopefully help with some of that, what they call time to first fix, because we're an active track logger. That's something that we really wanted to have that GNSS signal available, that position available as quickly as possible. The key thing that this does differently than some is that it is multi-constellation. So again, that larger antenna helps with this. The more signals we can receive, the better position we can get. It combines all of those signals from not just the United States constellation, but from other constellations that other countries have launched. And instead of having 10 satellites available at any given time, you may have 20 or 30 satellites available. So all of those signals combine really to increase your accuracy, and also, as was mentioned, to help with what they call jamming and spoofing. And some of these things are intentional events. If you read the NOTAMs, there's no shortage of intentional jamming events, even here in the continental United States, that occur. A lot of these are military exercises where they're intentionally degrading positioning capabilities so that they can test from a warfighting standpoint how they react to it. But it has implications. Often goes up as a kind of a cone out to civil aircraft as well. And that might create some operational limitations. We certainly fly in environments, and if you fly a lot, you probably have seen your GPS signal on your panel GPS momentarily go out, even if they were an unannounced event. So, we've had a number of people who've reported to us that they've been able to, keep flying using the Sentry GPS as a backup to their system when their primary, GPS, whether that was an IFR certified panel, part of their primary multifunction flight display, that went out and really compromised, what we would consider the safety of the mission there. While the Sentry GPS very often can ride out those type of things based on the nature of how it's designed and this multi-constellation capability. So we think that's really important as a backup, which is in many cases what these are. These aren't your primary instrument, but the safety that they provide in those scenarios is just so important as a pilot.
Well, let's transition to talking about mounting Sentry Plus in your aircraft. So Sentry Plus comes with a suction cup from RAM, and it's pretty neat. There's a little quick adapter on the back, so you can very quickly twist to lock it into the suction cup, and then put it on your window, either your left or right window, and then lock it in place, and it'll remain there the whole flight. You can also optionally mount it on the dash with the sort of lights facing the propeller or out the front of the airplane. Though my personal recommendation would be choosing one of the windows. You're going to be a little further away from all of the electromagnetic interference of your avionics and all those kinds of things. So you'll probably get better ADS-B performance if you mount it on one of the windows. What you're seeing here is the installation and configuration first run sort of modal in the app. So when you first connect to your Sentry Plus, ForeFlight's going to ask you where you're mounting it, the left window, right window. And this is important to set because that's how the AHRS or the synthetic vision and AHRS will work, is all based on this configuration here. And so is G-meter as well. It needs to know how it's oriented relative to the airplane in order to figure out which way is up for normal acceleration. You can also turn on these settings for auto power, automatic track log import, and auto zero pitch bank, which I would recommend having that one on. But if for any reason you don't have these on later, you can turn these on at more devices, Sentry Plus, after you've connected to the device. So some in-flight tips and best practices of how to fly with Sentry Plus. So I'll give 2 or 3 of my favorites, and then we'll see what other opinions we have. So mine is, like I've sort of alluded to and mentioned earlier, is I really like to use the automatic track log feature. So the tip I'd give you there is I would recommend using that. If you've got a Sentry Plus, it's just going to be the highest fidelity that you can get. And I've really enjoyed using that. But if you're using that and you've got that feature on, then you can probably go ahead and turn the auto start stop track log within ForeFlight off. Because if you're not familiar with that feature, ForeFlight, like your actual iPad, will record a track log automatically if you have that turned on. So if you've got them both turned on, well, then you'll have 2 track logs, which is probably not necessary. So I typically recommend having auto import track logs from Sentry Plus turned on only one device. You only need it to sync once, and then once it connects to the internet, it'll sync across all of your other devices automatically, and then you can turn the auto start stop off everywhere else. That'd be tip number 1. Tip number 2 would be use traffic for more than just traffic avoidance. Like, yes, use it for traffic avoidance, but you can also use it as a look ahead tool to see, which way are people entering the pattern? Is it, which runway are they using, or which approach is going on, or lots of other things that you can use traffic to tell you about other things well in advance to stay in front of the airplane. And then the third one I would use is if you're going to use ADS-B weather, go out and fly with ADS-B weather in different types of conditions before you really need to use it, so that you can sort of calibrate your brain to understand these conditions that I'm seeing on the iPad. These this NextRad image, this Cloud Tops image, or these these icing images, or whatever products you're using equate to this thing, this experience in the atmosphere that I've flown with. And so I know that, this thing on the iPad equals that thing out there in the real world. And that will make using ADS-B or FIS-B weather much more powerful for you if you can quickly look at something and understand what it really is out there in the real world.
Cole, I think that's a great point there, that to me, you should use your Sentry Plus on every flight, even if it's a nice weather day. Have it on there so you're comfortable with it and you know what to expect. And then when you need it, it's just a normal part of your flow.
Yeah, that's a great one. Any other in-flight best practices for you, John?
Yeah, a couple that come to mind. I mentioned earlier that you should make it part of your regular flow just as you're cruising along. Check your oil pressure, check your altitude, check your Sentry or check ForeFlight and make sure that it's still connected, it's still turned on. Make sure you're getting updated weather. You look at that timestamp in the top left-hand corner. It can just take a couple seconds, but make sure you're looking at good data. I think when you think about using weather in particular, there are two things you're often trying to avoid. One is thunderstorms. One is IFR conditions if you're VFR, or low IFR if you're IFR. When it comes to thunderstorms, yes, avoid the red, but as I mentioned earlier, use all those tools. Use the lightning. Use the pilot reports. I think that's an underrated tool. Pilot reports can give you a lot of flavor about what's really going on out there. So make sure you're really looking at all of them and not just getting sucked into the radar view. And then as I mentioned, just avoid the weather almost completely. You really shouldn't be picking through stuff with this. You should be changing your route to miss the weather by a wide margin. And I've found this is just easier with ATC. Just change your flight plan if you're IFR so you completely miss it instead of trying to narrowly avoid it. The one thing I always end with, though, when it comes to data link weather, is that you've got to remember that you're still the pilot in command. And no matter what you're looking at, it's just data. It's just a tool to help you make a better decision. But you as the pilot in command have to make that decision. And that sounds obvious, but a lot of times pilots can back themselves in a corner. A great example would be you're flying along, you see a really nasty looking gray cloud that seems to be billowing up in front of you. It really doesn't matter what the radar says there. You should probably miss that cloud. You should deviate around it. So I always like to say the eyes veto whatever the screen says. If it looks ugly out the front view of your airplane, then you should avoid it visually and just use that data link as a supporting tool there. Don't let it talk you into something you're not comfortable with.
Yeah, those are great tips, John. Those are all learning lessons as well. Well, thanks for all the color commentary there, Ryan and John. Sam, will pass it off back to you.
Thanks, Cole. Now, before we get into Q&A, here are just a few links you can follow up with if you want to learn more or watch other videos about this product. You can learn more at flywithsentry.com. You can buy Sentry Plus at flywithsentry.com/buy. Some spoilers there. If you're in the U.S., you'll buy it from Sporty's. If you're not in the U.S., you can buy it from a number of retailers in Europe. You can register for more webinars and watch past ones, including this one starting tomorrow at foreflight.com/webinars. And you can contact ForeFlight support at any time at team@foreflight.com. So let's move on to some questions. All right, so first question up here. Can Sentry and a panel-mounted ADS-B source, such as a GTX transponder, be connected to ForeFlight at the same time? I'm wondering if you lose electrical power in the plane, would Sentry take over so you don't lose ADS-B weather? John, do you want to answer that question?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. That's actually the exact setup I fly with. So I fly a couple different airplanes. One has a GTX 345 transponder, one has a Flight Stream. And the great thing here is you can fly along connected to both. The Garmin panel stuff connects by Bluetooth. The Sentry Plus connects via Wi-Fi. So both of those play nice together. Fly along with both of them connected. ForeFlight seamlessly, takes data from both sources. But that's actually, I think, a great reason to fly with a portable ADS-B receiver, because panel mount equipment does quit. And I love having that stuff in the panel, but it's great to fly with a backup. And so this is a great example where you have a really self-contained backup. If that panel does go dark for whatever reason, the avionics quits, or you have an electrical system malfunction, Sentry Plus with a built-in battery, it doesn't care. It's going to keep on going. It'll give you GPS position. It'll give you backup attitude, weather, all that information. So even in some pretty well-equipped airplanes, I really like to fly with a portable receiver just to make it an all-in-one backup. With ForeFlight on my iPad and a Sentry Plus, you've got a really tremendous amount of information that's available, and it's all self-contained.
Awesome. Thanks, John. Here's a question for Cole. I see one of the reviews says that weather is only available in the US. Is that the lower 48 or all 50, and doesn't include the Bahamas or any of the Caribbean?
Yeah, so that's a pretty common question there. So currently, ADS-B weather, more accurately described as ADS-B or FIS-B weather, is provided by ground stations. The FAA was the first to deploy these ground stations all over the continental United States. They're now available in all the lower 48, plus Alaska, plus Hawaii and Puerto Rico and Guam. And then I'd also like to point out there are a few other trials and other things going on as far as ADS-B weather. The first is there's one up in Canada going on. Our friends called CFIB. They're a volunteer group putting together some ADS-B weather trials going on in Canada. And then there are several other smaller ones around the globe. So we're hoping to see that coverage area continue to expand. As far as ADS-B traffic, you will see ADS-B traffic all over the globe these days. The ADS-B out requirements are varying by region, but there are ADS-B traffic targets now all over the globe.
All right, thanks, Cole. Back to John with this next one. How is the flight data recorder different from the track logs that ForeFlight produces? If I fly with a Sentry Plus, will it double the track log entry on my iPad in ForeFlight?
Great question. Yeah, the Sentry Plus has two main benefits. One is that same all-in-one integrated piece that I mentioned before in terms of backup, which is that it's always running, always recording, and it's automatic. So you don't have to have your iPad turned on. You don't have to have ForeFlight open. You don't even have to have your iPad with you if you forget it for some reason. Sentry, as long as it's on, is going to be recording. So it's totally automatic. It's totally self-contained. So you'll always have that track log, which is great for me. Sometimes on a long cross country, I'll put my iPad away, close the cover on it, and it's just easier to have Sentry Plus there logging. The other thing is you do get some more fidelity. You get some really good sensors in there. As Ryan talked about with the really accurate GPS, you've also got the AHRS data in there. So it's not just your GPS position, but you're recording pitch and bank. And then you've got the G meter as well. So you've got a richer playback experience when you go back to do that debriefing. You can see more than just your track over the ground. You can look at those graphs at the bottom of the track logs page in ForeFlight and really see some of the particulars. I like this a lot on an instrument approach. You can really see your altitude control, your speed control. If you really want to geek out, you can export that to a third-party app like Cloud Ahoy, which is a paid app that lets you really go even deeper into post-flight debriefing. So I think it's both more convenient and it's better quality data. The question there about doubling up track logs is a good one. The first time you fly with Sentry Plus, if you forget this, you'll probably notice it. But I think Cole mentioned this earlier. You do want to turn off automatic track logging in ForeFlight, because the app will try to record on its own in addition to Sentry Plus, and that's just going to double up your flight. So once you have track logging figured out with Sentry Plus, and if you want to turn on that automatic import, you can really go into ForeFlight settings and turn off the app's version of it and save you that doubling up.
Thanks, John. Here's one for Ryan. The FAA requirements for ADS-B are still a potential issue. I had a system that became equivalent to a dead weight some years ago.
Thanks. Yeah, there's a couple things to unpack there. One is the difference between the ADS-B out and the ADS-B in systems. The ADS-B out systems are what broadcast your position. That's what was mandated by January 1st, 2020 in the United States for access to certain airspace. And then the in systems simply receive those signals from other aircraft and receive signals from the FAA ground stations. That's what gives you the full traffic picture and gets you the weather. So I think to the heart of the question is that the out regulations on some of those very early systems weren't maybe well set yet. And there was some debate as that evolved pre-2020, back 10, even 15 years ago, about what exactly was going to be required. Once that was locked in, and we're on what's called version 2 ADS-B right now, that has maintained and stayed consistent. So there's really no compatibility issues here, especially as a receiver. We're able to receive even the older version 1 systems, which are very rare. They're really only present in a couple countries and a few people out there. But our receiver can receive both version 1, both version 2. So really not an issue in this case. And even from an ADS-B out perspective, we at uAvionix manufacture a lot of those systems, Sky Beacon and Tail Beacon, Tail Beacon X, for example. And those systems are all what are called a version 2 system. So really, if you equip with any of those today, there's no issues with compatibility in the US. Outside of the US, there's some countries that are moving to some space-based ADS-B systems. Canada is one of those. Again, nothing to do with Sentry. Sentry will still operate as normal, but there are some out systems that have some specific requirements and some countries that do, and a product of ours, Tail Beacon X, is designed to address that. But I think we're in pretty good shape now worldwide with understanding what needs to be in place, and hopefully not having anybody having expensive paperweights.
Thanks, Ryan. All right, last question here will be for Cole. Does this work on a corporate aircraft like a slow 0.73 Mach Citation CJ or a faster aircraft like a 0.90 Citation X?
I guess speed is a construct or relative. I would say 0.73 is a lot faster than my Dakota, but yeah. So the answer there is yes. Sentry Plus should work on all different types of aircraft. The only things you really have to watch out for, like just to mention, we have Sentry flying on everything from 172s all the way up to 747s. We see it deployed in Part 91 and 135 and DoD operations, all kinds of stuff all over the world. The only thing to watch out for if you're flying a much larger jet at very high altitudes is where you're mounting it. Some larger aircraft have alternating current heated windshields, which can degrade the GPS performance if there's a lot of interference, depending on how close you mount it to a windshield like that. So if you do have an aircraft that has AC heated windshields, I just recommend trying to mount it on a side window further away from that. But other than that, that's really the only thing in particular you need to look out for is your mounting location on some of those larger aircraft.
Thanks, Cole. And we actually have one more question here. This will be for John. Originally set up my Sentry ADS-B for a C206. I want to take it into a commander that is not ADS-B equipped without worrying about reporting the tail number from the 206.
Yeah, sort of related to, I think, what Ryan was saying. It's important to distinguish between ADS-B in and out. And so Sentry Plus, Sentry, any of these portables we're talking about is an ADS-B in product to receiver only. So you can easily jump between airplanes, no problem. And that's one of the things I love about it. There's consistency with a Sentry Plus and an iPad with ForeFlight. I essentially know my avionics package no matter which airplane I get into. Now, there is a benefit if you're in an airplane that has ADS-B out in the panel. That's where that automatic logbook entry is really slick, because Sentry Plus will actually self-detect the tail number that you're broadcasting. So when you get that draft logbook entry, you'll actually have your tail number auto-filled there, which is great. But if you jump then into an airplane that is not ADS-B out equipped, there's no problem, no big deal. You'll have to enter your tail number in that logbook entry. And you'll have to remember that if you're flying without ADS-B out in the panel, the traffic picture you see may be a little bit more limited. But otherwise, there's no problem at all jumping around airplanes. There's no settings you have to change. You don't have to register to a tail number. So these are all really great products. If you're a renter in a flying club and you jump around between airplanes, it's tailor-made for that.
Awesome. Thanks, John. And with that, I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Again, thanks, John. Thanks, Cole. Thanks, Ryan, for another really great presentation. As you can see on the screen here, and as you've been looking at for the past 20 minutes or so, you can learn more at flywithsentry.com. You can buy Sentry Plus at flywithsentry.com/buy. And especially remember, if you're in Europe, there are a couple of different resellers you can buy from. And so those list all of them. If you're in the US, you can just skip that website and go straight to sporties.com/Sentry, and it'll take you right there. Register for more webinars, and you'll be able to watch previous ones, as well as this one starting tomorrow at foreflight.com/webinars. And you can contact support at any time at team@foreflight.com. And if you asked any question during this that did not receive an answer, please do forward it to our pilot support team so that they can get back to you on that and make sure that your question gets answered. So thanks again, everyone, and we'll see you on the next webinar.